it takes to even understand this very gospel in which we preach. There must be an emptying of self in order for us to understand the gospel. To even understand it, there must be a level of humility within us. We must be humble to receive the engrafted word which is able to save our souls. We must exhibit humility in our idea of what we think and what we know being two separate things. Sometimes we get ahead of ourselves and we say, oh, I've heard a gospel sermon before. I know what the facts of the gospel are. But can you really look at the gospel anew? To where the same piercing that it had, the piercing effect on Jesus, can have a piercing effect on your heart today? He was pierced. And by the news of that, our hearts should be pierced. Let's take a look then at Isaiah 53. That's an easier one to find. Isaiah 53, and particularly verse 5, is all I want. Isaiah 53 and 5, and the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, of course, is Isaiah proclaiming when Israel is at just such a low point. They're at a low point in their disposition with God, but they were at a high point of ignorance at this point. You know what I mean? They were very low because of how they were in honoring God. They weren't at this point. And so they were kind of hard-headed, and that was running abundantly here. That Isaiah starts this off by saying, who has believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? Who could know this? Because he's saying, when he looks out among the land, Jerusalem isn't getting it. So then he begins to prophesy about the coming of the Lord. But verse 5 is what I want, but you almost can't go here without reading 1 through 5. It says, who has believed what they have heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He has no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. If we closely look at this verse, and just to break down the pattern here, the very first part of verse 5 says, but he was wounded for our transgressions. I want you to understand and not take the words for granted. Wounded in transgression. Transgression is our rebellion. I want you to know that this is not an accident here. Transgression there is a rebellion. It's our hard-headedness, much like Israel's. It is our disobedience. It's our ugly side. And it was for that not he was wounded, because he's not even talking about that part. Wounded there doesn't mean what you think. It simply means he was defiled. We defiled Christ by the way we acted. By our willingness to disobey God, it literally defiled him. That's the wound. But there's more. It says, then he was crushed for our iniquities. Our iniquities there is our guilt. And crushed, it says bruised in the King James, but it still simply means the same thing. This is where the punishment comes. He truly suffered for what we did. So we defiled him by our actions, and he didn't just take on the sin, he took on the guilt of the sin. Are you following this? It wasn't just that he took the sins of the world, as we say, because that part is true. But the guilt from the sin. Let's go back just a little bit. When things are done wrong, when we sin, there's always two parts we learn from this of that sin. It's the actual act that we did, and then it's the guilt from the act. How often has guilt made us do things that we shouldn't do? It was guilt that made Judas kill himself. He couldn't take, in realizing what he had done to God, the guilt was too much and he murdered himself. Guilt makes us do a lot of things that are not bound by God. Sometimes guilt we keep and we live with it for the rest of our lives over things we've done wrong. We can't forgive ourselves. The action was done, it's out in the open, but the guilt. See, the action is outward, the guilt is inward. And even when you have people who won't admit the guilt, they have it. They have it. And it literally eats you away inside. Jesus did not just take away our sins, but he took away the guilt of those sins. And then it says, upon him was the chastisement. That's the punishment that brought us peace. Now understand this peace here. This peace is basically our situation, if you will. Our standing with God. We were in a negative standing with God because of transgression. And there was a punishment for the standing we were in because we were guilty. So we defile God. He takes away those sins. He empties us of the guilt. And then he brings us peace. The punishment brought on for the sin, he took that too. So I'm getting three things here. I'm getting the actual act of our sin being taken with Jesus. I'm getting the guilt from our sin being taken with Jesus. And then the punishment. He took that too. Other than the deed, the guilt from the deed, and the punishment of the deed, is there anything else? He took them all. That's the gospel we preach. He took away the fact that I sinned. He took away the guilt from me. And then to turn around and take my punishment too. Jesus did that. And then it says, and by all of that, which here in the text just calls it stripes, but by that, we're healed. Healed there means restored. We are reconciled. Sound familiar? But it is by that that we are reconciled. When you begin to really think that somebody would do that, now listen to Paul's words in Romans 5. Talk about while somebody was in the weak state, while somebody was helpless, while they're at the lowest point in their life, it is at that moment that Jesus died. And then it says that, if somebody was good, you might have someone willing to die for them, maybe give their life in a certain circumstance. But here is somebody that while we were yet sinners, died for us. In the midst of our ugliness, he died. And it's this gospel that we preach. Now, I mentioned earlier that it was his death that reconciled us. That is true. But it is his life by which we are saved. Now listen closely. His life, which we have a mirror recording in the Gospels and in the lives of those men who dwelled with him, they told us what his life was like. It is that life that we, as children of God, live every day to prove we belong to him. Well, who are we proving that to? One, we're proving that to the world, because they literally will see God in us. We're proving that to our fellow brothers and sisters because it gives us uplift and encouragement. But more than anything else, we are showing God that we believe by living in response of the gospel like Jesus did. We live the life Jesus did, and we're saved because of it. So there are just things when we talk about the